Hello, everyone. Today we are lucky to be joined by Mark Agostini. Mark is currently a Ph.D. candidate in Anthropological Archaeology at Brown University, working with the Pueblo of San Ildefonso, New Mexico, for his dissertation. His collaborative research partnership with the tribe investigates historical ties of the oldest archaeological village called Perage to ancestral Pueblo populations from the nearby Parajito Plateau and to modern-day San Ildefonso Pueblo. So without further ado, Mark, please share with us your amazing research.
Thank you, Emlyn, for the introduction, and my greetings to all the students that will be watching this at Heritage, at the Heritage School. That's right?
Yeah.
And I hope that all your families are safe during the holidays, and wishing all a Happy New Year. Well, I'll begin by just sort of, I think what would be most useful to all you students there is not necessarily going into the weeds about my research. I'll do that partly, but I think an exposure to Southwest archaeology in general and some of the things that have really fascinated me and got me into this line of work is something that I'd like to sort of share in the beginning, and also provide some context for where we're looking at and what the different cultural areas are. But Emlyn's correct. I work with the Pueblo of San Ildefonso, and my dissertation is looking at this this site here on the left of my title page. This was a site that had not been looked at since 1906, but it's the earliest village from where the modern day people living at San Ildefonso Pueblo lived prior to the advent of Spanish colonialism. So they were living there until probably the early 1600s, late 1500s, and then relocated to where they are today. And so this is a map that was generated left with LIDAR, which is a method of mapping that is used particularly in areas with high jungle canopy because the lasers penetrate through the trees and give you a clear picture of what is on the Earth's surface. This can be used though in places like the Southwest, where a lot of times they're constructing their villages with adobe, which is a clay material, and that pretty much disintegrates over time. And that's what we have here in this map, are what's left of the mounds of adobe room blocks that would have made up the village. But I'll just kind of dive in with a little bit of an overview. So for anyone who isn't familiar with Southwest archaeology, there are many different culture areas and many different cultural groups. But roughly, beginning at say AD 600, all the way up to European contact, many of these cultural groups persisted. The area that I focus on is the Ancestral Puebloans, which you see in what is now the Four Corners region of the Southwest. So that would incorporate states of Arizona, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico. But if you go further to the south, areas of what is now Phoenix, Arizona, you get the Hohokam culture. They have more of an affinity with some of the cultural groups that you see in Mesoamerica. They build these large ball courts, which are quite fun to see. And that is a northern extension of Mesoamerican practices, and by that I mean the Maya and groups to the south in areas of Mexico and Guatemala. The Mogollon is another cultural group famous for some really beautiful pottery. They all make pottery, of course, but I'm just thinking about some of the pottery there. And plenty, while these areas are delineating cultural groups, with this black line surrounding it, there's plenty of movement within those groups, and to some extent, interactions between them. So I know that some of the questions posed to me were about movement and ancestral Pueblo people, and it's important to keep in mind that they were not static people. They were highly mobile when they had to be, and they obviously made some really amazing villages too, and communities, and what you might even call ceremonial centers, which I'll get to in a minute. And just to keep in mind, the time span that we're kind of talking about again is Common Era, starting at around 800 and all the way up into the historic period, so the 1500s, the 1600s, just to give you a chronology. Today in New Mexico, particularly in the area where I work, which is the middle northern Rio Grande, or the Rio Grande Valley, there are 19 existing Pueblo communities. I am quite close with people from San Ildefonso Pueblo, Jemez Pueblo, Poaki Pueblo, and to some extent Santo Domingo. One thing I wanted to talk about here is that you'll notice that they're very closely next to each other, and there's a reason for that. That the fertile Rio Grande River, which is not, I guess you can't really see it here, but it basically, their communities are on the eastern and western banks of the Rio Grande, and that's for the purposes of living an agrarian lifestyle, growing corn and other things to subsist on. And the Rio Grande is the lifeblood of these communities today, as it was in the prehistoric past too. Also, there is a great deal of interconnectivity between these pueblos. If you ever get a chance to go out to some of the feast days that happen in the summertime, where the indigenous people from these communities don their religious regalia and dance in the plazas of these pueblos, you'll notice that the social division within the societies, the pueblos, and between them have a great deal of connection. So you'll have people, say, from Jemez Pueblo who have family from Santo Domingo, and they'll dance, there and participate in the kind of subcultural practices there. And they'll be members of different types of societies there. And there's medicine societies and all kinds of things that are bound up in traditional practices. So I just wanted to kind of drive home the point that while you can look at these places as individual historical and archaeological areas, they're deeply connected. And that's really part of what it is to be from these places, and what it means to study it in a way that is appropriate. So I wanted to take you back to the AD 1100s, 8900s, all the way up to 8800 to 1100 about. And if you have never been to New Mexico, you should definitely be aware of a place called Chaco Canyon, which is in north central New Mexico. So it's a ways north of where the Pueblo people reside today. And actually many of the ancestral sites, villages of the modern day Pueblo people, you'll find that it is north of where they are. And there's a great deal of literature that talks about people coming from the north and moving southward. So if you've ever heard of Mesa Verde, that's in Colorado, Chaco Canyons in north central New Mexico, and eventually you have this kind of movement north to south of Pueblo people over many centuries, even a millennia. Chaco Canyon is an enigmatic, puzzling place for archaeologists, partly because there's a great deal of continuity with Chaco Canyon with respect to the contemporary Pueblos, but there's also a lot of discontinuity. Namely, you'll see all these places: Chetro Kettle, Pueblo Alto, New Alto, Quincletso. Pueblo Bonito is the large one at the top here. These are great houses. They're called great houses because if you ever go, they're immensely large places, many, many rooms. And the circular structures that you see are kivas, which I'll kind of explain in a minute. But monumental architecture and the idea of what Chaco was to the ancestral Pueblo people is not entirely mysterious, but there's a lot of theorizing as to what it was. And the general archaeological consensus is it was some kind of a gathering space for people from many different Pueblo communities to aggregate and come together at meaningful times of the year. And by meaningful, I mean times of the year that are important to people that participate in agriculture as a means of subsistence. So solstices, equinox, events where the movement of the heavenly bodies of the planets affect your daily life in a very meaningful way. And also, this was undoubtedly a religious place. So when you think of Jerusalem, like the Wailing Wall or the Dome of the Rock or Mecca, this was sort of this kind of religious socio-political center of the Pueblo world at the time. Now, you might look at this when you go there and you might not recognize or really understand what you're seeing, but you're actually only seeing the subterranean part of this architectural feature. And this is called a kiva, but more exactly a great kiva. And great kivas are another thing that is somewhat distinct from Chaco relative to the modern day Pueblo people. All Pueblos pretty much have kivas, and kivas are these subterranean spaces where people participate in religious ceremonies and they go under the earth. And going under the earth has a lot to do with Pueblo cosmology, and by that I mean, you know, the origin story. So if you think of a Judeo-Christian version of an origin story, it might be Adam and Eve, right, or Genesis. But for indigenous communities, it's they have them too, but they're different. And one of them, one aspect of Pueblo origin stories that is consistent across the many Pueblos that I've mentioned is an emergence from under the earth or up from a lake into the world above. And what we see with kivas partly is this marking the sacred space of below the earth and conducting, you know, your religious ceremonies below the earth. This is a reconstruction of what it would look like inside a great kiva. This is a reconstruction of a kiva at Aztec ruin, which is in New Mexico, and I encourage you to get out there if you ever do. This is the beauty of these places, is that they're all either national parks or you know, historic parks, and you know, you can easily go if you ever go on a road trip with your family. But so just to show you the you know, this is what it looks like in the inside, that there be plaster on the walls, and oftentimes there's actually beautiful murals of various wonderful things like gods and exotic birds and things like that. Rainbows would be adorning the walls of a kiva. And there are areas where there would be a foot drum where people would dance on it to make reverberating sounds. So inside a kiva is a deeply sonorous, or, you know, kind of almost like going to church. You know, there's all these things happening that are esoteric and maybe you don't understand, but there's a lot going on. And just kind of continuing with Chaco Canyon, this is Pueblo Bonito, which is one of the most unique of the great houses there, and you can just see how large it is. And here, and of course, in archaeology, a challenge that I think we all face is having the imagination to really see what it looked like in the year, you know, 1000. And luckily, you know, pairing with artists, we're able to kind of get a reconstructed view of what Pueblo Bonito might have looked like. And here you can see the multi-storied rooms on the kind of the backside there of the D shape, and you can see the small entranceway into Pueblo Bonito. It kind of looks like a little door. It's illuminated, and you can imagine going into Pueblo Bonito from the outside, and when you enter, you're just kind of blown away by the huge walls and the wonderful large kivas. So this was a major draw of all communities at the time, and it really was the epicenter of the Pueblo world. What also came into Chaco Canyon were many exotic, wonderful things from all over the Southwest and further down into what I was calling, you know, Mesoamerica, which is Central America. You have macaws and macaw feathers, live birds coming up, copper to make bells, shells from West Mexico, and even see these jars up on the top right here. The turquoise covered cylinder is actually a basket, so that wouldn't have held water. But turquoise is, was an exotic prized stone that was used to make beads and also, really unique items like this vessel here. But at left is what's called a Chaco cylinder vessel, and this is a form that's fairly unique to Chaco Canyon. And believe it or not, what they would drink out of it in some cases was cacao, which is commonly known as chocolate. So the elites living in this community, the people that were year-round residents, we have an idea that people would often visit Chaco, but there were only a few people that lived in Pueblo Bonito and these great houses year-round. And so some of the elites would have actually drunk hot chocolate, basically. And imagine that being a precious commodity, like a very hard thing to get, because cacao is coming up from Central America and it has to travel great distances, right? One other thing about the ancestral Pueblo world at the time of Chaco is this preoccupation with aligning architecture, roads, and great houses to great houses, and even larger swaths of space connecting places through lunar and solar alignments. And so there are many, many examples. Whoops. Oh, no. Not too far. So there are many examples of lunar and solar alignments. Pueblo Bonito, which I just mentioned, it's actually on an east-west axis. So the sun comes perfectly up over that community. And this is a very common thing among Pueblo people to create these kinds of alignments with the heavens. And at right is something called the sun dagger, which I'll explain a little about. The sun dagger is a petroglyph. Is a petroglyph, which is a way of making rock art where you peck into the stone and it creates a depression, and that is a lasting trace of some kind of a piece of iconography that you want to put on the wall permanently or on a rock face. And so the sun dagger is atop a large butte, which is in the canyon called Fajada Butte. And on this slab is this spiral, these two spirals. And you'll notice from the diagram that the ancestral Pueblo people actually managed to figure out how to mark these different solstice events and equinoxes and even the major standstills of the moon. So just like the Earth orbiting the sun, the moon is also on its own cycles, as you know, on a 30-day cycle. But it also goes through much larger cycles, and this can take many, many different years. And I believe the major standstill of the moon is on an 18 and 9-year cycle, I want to say. But you can see that the dagger is a beam of light, and it moves across this petroglyph in a meaningful, unique way. So the dagger is in the middle of the spiral at the summer solstice, and then you get two spirals at the winter solstice, and the equinox and the minor and major moon standstills are at the center and periphery of this pictograph. So petroglyph, I mean. So just to keep in mind that there's many, many different practices and many different ways of looking at archaeology, and this is one that is particularly interesting to me, which is archaeoastronomy. Another thing that I want to just kind of put on people's radar is an event in Pueblo history, fast forwarding all the way to 1680. And this is a time that is referred to as the first American Revolution, preceding our own as colonists against Great Britain. This is an example of all the Pueblos, all those ones that I mentioned in the beginning, rising up against the Spanish in a rebellion that resulted in their deaths en masse, and also the destruction of their Catholic missions as well. You can see in this picture from 1976 some Native people, taking the crosses down and destroying the bells and hanging the Franciscan friars that would have been running the missions. The Pueblo Revolt was led by a spiritual leader named Popé, and in his hand, you can see in this statue, which is in the Washington D.C. Capitol, he has some cordage with different knots in it, and you can imagine how do you coordinate a rebellion with so many different communities when you can't keep track of time effectively. And so what Popé did is he gave individuals at each pueblo a knot of cordage, and each day they would undo a knot. And when they ran out of knots, that's when they knew that they had to, coordinate their attack against the Spanish, because, trying to fight them individually would not work. You needed a coordinated effort. And so the Pueblo Revolt managed to push the Spanish conquerors of the Pueblo people out of New Mexico for over a dozen years. And that allowed for Pueblo people to go back to a way of life before they were subjugated by the Spanish. So this is just a meaningful period in history that I wanted you all to be aware of. And also, potters are often kind of experimenting with their crafts in the Pueblos. And this is a work by Jason Garcia of Santa Clara Pueblo, where he makes these really cool tiles in a comic book style. And he often, uses iconography to show, things that would have been happening in the Pueblo Revolt. And this is an example of them breaking up the mission bells with hammers. And so kind of getting into my own work, I practice Indigenous and collaborative archaeology. And George Nicholas, who is a Canadian scholar at Simon Fraser University, and he has really spearheaded the theoretical path of Indigenous archaeology and defining it as archaeology that is done with, by, and for Indigenous people. Now, when you hear the name Indigenous archaeology, you might initially think, oh, well, does that mean that you have to be Indigenous to practice archaeology? That's a bit of a misnomer. There are many Indigenous archaeologists, and it is certainly an advantage to be Indigenous and be an Indigenous archaeologist, because it allows you to align more so with the values of your community. And the reality of archaeology is that it is an extractive discipline. And by that, I mean, you're coming into areas with cultural heritage, rare materials that are a limited resource, and you're taking it, putting it somewhere, putting it in a museum, sometimes destroying it or part of it to figure out, to answer some of your questions. And this runs against some, more traditional conservative values of Indigenous groups. But not only that conservative, but it's more that, they want archaeology done in a way that will maximize the benefit for their community. And that's pretty much what it means to be an Indigenous archaeologist, is to conduct, conceive, and carry out an archaeology project that maximizes the benefit to the community in a long-term way. And collaborative archaeology, which is really a sister field, is described very broadly as a range of strategies that seek to link the archaeological enterprise with different publics by working together. And so what are those different publics? Well, it can be a university and an Indigenous community and a museum, or just heritage stakeholders and the general public. So in a way, even in this talk, your school learning about this would be considered, a different public, where you are privy to what's going on the project. And just for further reading, if you're interested in knowing more about what Indigenous archaeology is, this is Joe Watkins, who is Choctaw, I think. and he did his PhD at the University of New Mexico, and his dissertation was on this, and he later published it as this book. And he says that archaeology is the study of people, not things, that those people have a present and a future as well as a past, and that the archaeologists must integrate the concerns of the American Indian people with their research. Now, he's writing this in 2000, which is some time ago. There was originally an impetus to collaborate with Native Americans more purely on the basis of legislation. And this law is called NAGPRA, which stands for the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And this was passed in 1990. And so that law basically mandates that any cultural heritage associated with things like burials or any artifacts considered sacred or deeply religious has to go back to Indigenous communities in some way. Or it has to be left alone. If you say encounter human remains while excavating, there's a limit to how much you can encounter before having to stop excavation, and that's a result of NAGPRA. But Joe Watkins is sort of taking the discipline further and saying that we need to go beyond just kind of the call of a single law. We need to really work closely with Indigenous people, learn from each other, and build a partnership. And so I just wanted to kind of very briefly talk about some things in my own work. And part of doing collaborative archaeology as opposed to traditional archaeology, as the Joe Watkins quote states, is that it's about people. It's not about material. It's not about being really interested in stone tools or pottery purely. It has to do with, what about the people? And my project, working at Perage, it really begins with oral histories that interest me. And these are some excerpts from oral histories. So Perage was inhabited by their ancestors before the coming of the Spaniards, and they removed thence to the east bank of the Rio Grande. So this little piece of oral history talks about where they were and that they were there prior to the Spanish coming, and they're now on the east bank of the Rio Grande. So that's some important information if you want to understand the relationship of Perage to San Ildefonso Pueblo and to the Pajarito Plateau, which is the another ancestral region that's older than where Perage, than Perage. Another is when the mesa life grew unbearable from lack of water and removal to the valley became a necessity, a detachment or a group of people from owinge, which is a pueblo on the Pajarito Plateau, founded the Pueblo of Perage. So there's another example of a piece of oral history that really tells the movement of people, right? It says that drought was common living in the on top of the Pajarito Plateau, and so they had to move from there and found this new pueblo in the valley, which is closer to where San Ildefonso is today. And this last one talks about how there may have been some tension between living with people that were already there and newcomers coming down from the plateau. So there were some good people and some bad people. The bad people were envious of the good people who had lots of corn and wheat and killed lots of deer. So you can see that there's, in this story, there's a tension over resources, maybe. I'll skip this one here. And so just to kind of show you where I do my work, this is the Tewa Basin, which is not too far from Santa Fe. And these are some of the villages that I've looked at. And the ones here on the left facing side, where you can see the kind of jagged edge, that represents the Pajarito Plateau. So these three sites here called Puye, owinge, and Cherokee, those are all earlier Pajarito sites, which would date to the 1300s into the 1400s. And then Perage is this unique one that's situated right in the valley. And then right over the river to the east side is where San Ildefonso is today. And this is a map from my master's work, and I just wanted to show you where everything is. So my main research questions, given all this oral history that's sort of guiding the archaeology project, is it possible using ceramic analysis to distinguish between ceramics made at sites on the Pajarito Plateau, with clays local to the plateau, and ceramics produced at Perage, which is a different area. It's geologically different. If so, is there evidence of ceramics produced on the Pajarito Plateau at Perage? So can we use ceramic analysis to trace the movement of people from one place to the next and actually kind of add to the stories that people came from there and founded Perage? Is it possible using architectural analysis to identify structural similarities in the historical landscapes where the two villages function? So if people truly did come from places on the Pajarito Plateau and founded and created Perage, you would expect some kind of architectural, similarity. If you build a house and you move and build another house, there should be some similarities in how you do it. And this is all to say that this kind of focused study on these individual sites that are important to San Ildefonso Pueblo, how can this broaden our understanding of early Tewa, which is the cultural group Tewa Pueblo landscape? How can we better understand the relationship between the Pajarito Plateau, Perage, and San Ildefonso? How are they connected? How are they different? And because of COVID, I haven't really been able to get into the field and actually do analysis on the ground. So a lot of what I've been doing so far for my dissertation has been remote work. But remapping the site digitally is something that I've begun to do. And at left, you can see a map that was done in 1906 of the Pueblo. And this was all done with what's called chain and compass, which is a very rudimentary way of mapping and by today's standards, inaccurate. At right, you can see a Google Maps image, and you can kind of see the similarity of the shape, but it's really not sufficient to take measurements and prepare for going into the field and actually looking at some of these features in person. And so what I use is called LiDAR, and I mentioned this earlier. It's a method of laser mapping, and I used LiDAR data from the tribe in the partnership, and I started to look at this particular village, and you can see that everything kind of pops out. You can see a lot more features. One thing that I noticed in particular is that the map from 1906 actually excluded some interesting features that might actually even be kivas. So in this L-shaped section up here, you see the kind of semicircular, two semicircular features there in the plaza. Those actually might be kivas that were not mapped previously in 1906. So this is something that we're interested in ground verifying it to update the map for the tribe so they know what they have. Another thing is assessing the damage done to the archaeological village by way of this road here. You can see this this kind of mound here. The southern half has been destroyed by a road. So we need to go and kind of assess the damage and see if we can do anything to conserve that structure and reduce environmental degradation like erosion and things like that. And again, just some of the things that we've been able to surmise from the LiDAR is that there are previously unmapped kivas like this circle here. There may even be room blocks of earlier aspects of the village. So the village was probably founded in 1400, but there may be some architectural features that go earlier than that, maybe by 50 years or more. And there's also evidence of looting or maybe even early excavation work that was carried out. So this is all adding to the story of the village. Another thing that we plan to do, which I did a few years ago, is a surface artifact survey. So we don't dig generally when we're doing collaborative archaeology because that's quite invasive. So we try to only look at artifacts that are on the surface. And so we find things like pottery at left there. And there are other site features like this one to the right, which is some type of a a feature that might have been used in religious ceremonies or to mark an important cardinal direction at the site. But you can see all these depressions in the stone, and pecking stones like that is a common practice among the Tewa at sites. And of course, a small shirt is hard to, it's hard to tell what it is, but that's something that we archaeologists have to do. We have to try to figure out what type it is by the color and the style of the painting. And these are some examples of Tewa whole vessels. These are on display at Pecos National Historic Park. And this is a biscuit bee bowl, which is a very common pottery type at places like Perage. And these things that look like hands are called owinges. And this is actually a stylized a horned serpent, which is a real animal, but it has religious significance and importance in the Southwest. And the vessel at right is a glazeware jar or olla, and these were valuable trade goods that would have made their way into many of the Rio Grande pueblos. Here's me and my collaborator on the left, Dr. Aguilar of San Ildefonso Pueblo. So I work with someone who is from San Ildefonso and has his Ph.D. in archaeology, and he has studied archaeology in his own community. He has actually conducted archaeology on top of that landform in the back, which is called Black Mesa. And atop that feature, his ancestors and ancestors of other Pueblo people held out against the Spanish, who were trying to basically assert their dominance over their communities. So this was a sort of place where they were able to defend themselves by throwing rocks down on the Spanish, who were coming to try to reconquer them in 1692. And so also it's pretty hard to see sometimes what you're looking at. And you might just look at this and say, oh, it's just a bunch of rocks. But what you're actually looking at is the remnants of walls, wall sections. At the left, where you can see my collaborator, there's sort of like a vague line of stones, and then there's a perpendicular line, and that represents basically a corner to some kind of a room block. So it's very ephemeral. It's hard to see some of these things, so it takes a bit of a trained eye. And then another thing that I do in my own work, which it's of broad use, but something that archaeologists do is chemical analysis on artifacts. And this can be pottery, or it can be organic material like feathers, or wood, or obsidian and stone. There's all kinds of ways to date where things come from. Of course, there's carbon dating, which dates how old things are. But this type of analysis is more about trying to figure out where things come from on the landscape. And I use this method called inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry. And mass spectrometry, all it is it's a way of a laser is fired at a sample of something, in this case pottery, and it takes very, very small amounts of that material, what's called parts per million, and it puts it through a mass spectrometer. And the mass spectrometer basically sorts all the different elements that are in that sample and its concentrations. And when you sum all that and you compare it across samples, it tells you, how different, pottery type A is from pottery type B. And that sometimes corresponds to places on the landscape. And here is my master's thesis work, which relates directly to my dissertation work. And it's a little confusing. I'll explain it really quick. But each dot color here in this biplot, which is it's an aggregate of all the different elements that were in the sample that I analyzed. I think I analyzed something like 100 pieces of pottery. And what this chart shows is that Cuyamungue, which is the red village right here, it's right by 38. That's in the Rio Grande Valley, okay? And all the other villages are on the Pajarito Plateau, which is a different type of geologic area. It's made of what's called tuff, which is the result of volcanic eruptions. So kind of like lava rock in a way. And what this shows is that people that were making pottery on the Pajarito Plateau were bringing their pottery into the Rio Grande, because you have sites from the Pajarito represented in this kind of left side of the graph, but you don't see a lot of Rio Grande Valley samples showing up on the Pajarito Plateau. And so the problem with this is the interpretation of what this means, right? And so does it mean that people were moving from some of these places like Ottawa and Puye down to places like Cuyamungue and living there permanently? Well, it could mean that. It could mean that they were taking their pots with them and they just stayed there. Or it could be some kind of a trade, right? I mean, maybe you make pots and you bring them down to places like Cuyamungue, and maybe they give you something in return that doesn't show up in the archaeological record, right? Like corn or cotton, which we know that they grew. So I just wanted to show you this type of analysis because it's a pretty quick way to figure out some things about how people are moving on the landscape and how they're interacting. And it's also something that I use precisely because it's fairly non-destructive. So in this sample tray here, these are very small. These are only like 5 millimeters each. And I break a little piece off of a piece of pottery. And because it's so non-destructive, all it does, it makes this very small crater in that little sample. The laser fires and it gets the sample. And those little pieces can go back to the archaeological village. We can put everything back exactly where we found it. And that's something that is in line with Indigenous community values, right? That they don't want to see their cultural heritage leave their communities in mass and go into museum archives, because that's the way it's been for a long time. They want to retain autonomy as a people and over their heritage. And that's something that I believe in, and that's something that's a big part of this type of archaeology. So that's pretty much all I have, Emily.
Yeah, that's great. If you want, we can just jump right into the couple of the questions that I had. And I think the first one is, this is a pretty niche field. So what got you interested in it?
I'm going to use an interesting background real quick. Well, I guess, growing up, I was always interested in, I think I was born really interested in this stuff, to be honest with you. I was always digging in the dirt, and I grew up in New England, a historic town with a lot of colonial and Native American history. And I used to dig in my backyard, and I'd find old bottles and things. And so I was very early on inspired to do archaeology. I was always kind of messing around with it as a very young boy. But I would say that what really got me interested in this particular area was the friendships that I made on an archaeology project with a team from Harvard University back in 2013 and 14. And I just really became close friends with people from Jemez Pueblo, actually, which you saw on the map. And I wanted to just kind of stay and remain a part of their lives, and I wanted them to remain part of mine.
Yeah. So when you were like growing up in the New Englands, did you have like any interactions with Indigenous communities, or is like the Indigenous part of your research something that you realized when you were like directly conducting like archaeological work?
I think it was the latter. It was really, I took plenty of road trips to archaeological sites growing up as a kid, all the way out to New Mexico. I saw some of these places when I was young, like 10 years old. But it wasn't until after undergraduate, my undergraduate career in college, that I started to realize that if I wanted to do archaeology, I wanted to do it with, for, and by the Indigenous communities that I allied with. Because if you don't do that, again, it's the problem of what we call the extractive paradigm, which is you're coming in and you're taking stuff and you're not really giving a whole lot back, because when we publish in academia, it's very niche, as you said. It's very specialized, doesn't reach the public, and it certainly doesn't benefit the Indigenous communities enough unless you outline your project so it aligns with some things that they already want to know about or things that they're interested in. And so something that I didn't mention in talking about my project is that fortifying land claims is a big part of the Pueblos. And so, things like water rights, or as I say, the Pajarito Plateau is a very big place. Los Alamos National Lab is atop the Pajarito Plateau, and I don't know if you know about Los Alamos, but they were famous for developing the atomic bomb. They're a major scientific laboratory, and there's some tension there because some of the Pueblo sites are owned by them. I think the one that I mentioned, Cherokee, that's actually owned by Los Alamos, but it's an ancestral site of San Ildefonso and a few other Pueblos. So doing this type of study, it fortifies that a place like Perage is their heritage site, not anyone else's, mainly anyway, and that it's also directly connected to this larger culture area called the Pajarito Plateau, which again, it bolsters a defense for the Pueblo against any kind of contestation of their land sovereignty in the future. And I think we all know that can easily happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this idea of like ethically engaging with like the communities, in terms of just more of like, I guess, historical interpretation. So once you have like the archaeological data, how can I guess non-Indigenous people like I guess present it or read with the research in a way that like gives a proper respect to like the past of these communities?
Do you mean how it's like what is done with the data, the results?
Or some communities I feel have like voiced their concerns about like being reduced within like historical depictions. So when you're working like directly with data or like artifacts from Indigenous communities, like how does reduction occur? And if it does, can like archaeologists like reduce that amount in any way?
Yeah, I guess there is a bit of a problem with talking about ancestral Pueblo as some kind of a monolith, like a monolithic culture. I don't think you'll find that a lot of archaeologists and anthropologists do that anymore. But it still is sort of a problem. But I think like, in the presentation I just gave, I tried to show the diversity of ancestral Pueblo culture areas, and also how there are plenty of things that you can recognize as continuous in a way, like that there's still kivas, there's still plenty of common material culture, like the pottery is similar. They still use and prize turquoise in jewelry making and all kinds of things. So there's a lot of material continuities. There's a lot of oral historical continuities, but there's a lot of differences too. And a study like this allows for a community like San Ildefonso to emphasize those differences from them to other Pueblos, how they're different from other Pueblos, but how they're similar and how they were maybe even more united or had more in common at a particular time in history. This is something that we see a lot in the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 that I mentioned. You had all these communities allying together against the Spanish, but actually after the revolt, you had a period of what's called factionalism, where communities started taking sides against each other, and this is something that's provided a lot, I think, of perspective for the Pueblos themselves, for their own history, but also, what is the broader story about rebellion and revolution? Is that oftentimes you have people uniting against some common, authoritarian force, but afterwards you have to sort of build a new society, and there are universal problems and difficulties with that. So I would say that while studying Pueblo people, it's easy to sort of reduce their particular histories in favor of what anthropologists are often concerned with, which is universal patterns of human cultures. I think a study like this is trying to walk the line between the two.
Yeah, and definitely talking about like that diversity. I know that map that you showed us of like different pueblos showcased like the fact that there are a lot of them. So is there a reason why you specifically like centered on the San Ildefonso like pueblo when like working with this research? Maybe anything specific about their movement patterns or like yeah, the access that you had to their research?
Yeah, I guess for those that are thinking about going on to do maybe study something like archaeology or anthropology in college, many of you are at the gate and ready to go out, and hopefully the pandemic will be over by the time you all get into college, which would be really nice. But yeah, I would say that if you get to college, you're going to have an advisor, and your advisor is going to do something very specific, and he might or she might kind of steer you to study something that's sort of relevant to what they do, so they can help you study it, but not the same. So it's kind of a discovery for yourself, right? And I went to the University of Vermont in Burlington, and my advisor, he worked in East Central Arizona, and he is uh, more a ceramic specialist. And I sort of followed in his footsteps a little bit, but I decided to ultimately study in the area where I do in New Mexico today because well, it was interesting to me, but also you'll find that wherever you end up being able to work it can be quite random. So I got a job working with a professor at Harvard, and he works at Jemez Pueblo, and I wasn't particularly interested in the archaeology that he was doing, but it was interesting enough for me to try to carve out an area for me to work. And it's a lot of, I guess what I'm getting at is the informal network really kind of steered, in my case, what I decided to study. One of my advisors, students here at Brown, he was originally at the University of Pennsylvania. My collaborator, Dr. Aguilar, who is from San Ildefonso, he and I have been friends for a long time. And one day we went out to this site called Perage, and it was really just eye-opening that no one had done anything studying this village before. And so that's really what got me going with trying to work with the Pueblo, was just the lack of study on a place that's really important, and the being in the right place to possibly get it to go.
Yeah, and that like pottery analysis that you showed us, you mentioned that the movement could have been due to like different reasons, like trade or just like migration in general. So what would the significance of those different reasons be in the context of like the research that you were working with?
Good question. Yeah, so for instance, if given that we have oral histories about a place like Paraguay, that people from Ottawa specifically maybe founded this pueblo, and then from there people migrated over to where San Ildefonso is today. If we were to find, say, in one specific area at Paraguay, say one area of a room of several rooms, where it was predominantly, say, pottery that was produced at Ottawa on the Pardo Plateau, that would suggest that that area of the site may have been where migrants were living. If you get this type of, and by that I mean migrants from the Pardo Plateau, were kind of all together in this section at the village of Paraguay, and then maybe in another sector, it was people that had been living, were people that were living at the Pueblo for longer, or who were already living in that area, in the valley, and it didn't come down from the plateau. So that would be a really prime example of social division within a single village where you have people living in one spot that are from a different place, excuse me, and people that are from there originally, but perhaps not interacting with migrants as much. You know, and that could be representative of single family unit also that was coming down from the plateau, and they brought their pottery with them. But also conversely, if say we find pottery is produced only locally in the valley, and that there's no pottery coming down from the Pardo Plateau, so that it seems as though everyone who's living there is making pottery locally, and there's not a lot of stuff coming from elsewhere. Well, that might suggest that when people come and moved somewhere, they didn't bring pottery with them, and then maybe they started taking up practices of making stuff in a local tradition, which is actually really common. You know, when people would intermarry and move from one place to another, they would have to make pottery in the tradition of the village where they were marrying into. And that's a really common thing. So I guess either way, no matter what the data are, we can figure something out.
Yeah, for sure. And especially like the idea of movement. I know we were talking about earlier, like some of the more like cultural meaning to them. So the Tewa people, there is, I think in one of your articles you talked about there's like a center place to their culture. What like is a center place to, I guess, the audience who might not know? And yeah, I think we can just start from there.
Yeah, sure. So going back into the beginning of my presentation, you can think about center place as sort of where things begin and where things return, in a way, is the kind of my spontaneous way of phrasing it. So Chaco Canyon can be argued to be a ceremonial center place, or some kind of a center place concept, because you have people that are living all over the area, and then they come together, come back to this place and participate in trade and religious ceremonies and all kinds of wonderful things that they're able to do maybe a couple times a year, and that they're constantly working toward that end, perhaps, you know, growing crops to bring into Chaco Canyon. Something that we know about Chaco Canyon is things moved into Chaco, but not a lot of things flowed out. And that's another way of kind of conceptualizing center place, that things move toward the center in a continuous way, and not just movements of people, but movements of things too. And so, but center place is a very abstract concept, and it's hard to answer it in a very direct way, I would say. But you know, if we're talking about the Rio Grande Pueblos, the concept of center place is sort of a moving target through history. So Chaco, you know, those great houses in that whole canyon, that very well may have been a center place. But for the Rio Grande Pueblos today, each village is a center place. So, and as you move outward from the village, you get different tiers of what would be considered sacred geography or sacred part of the landscape. So there are cardinal mountains for each village, and at the center is the village itself. So it's a question of it's more a question of scale and time for what is a center place. But the long and short of it is that it is about making things balanced and ensuring that people can return to physical places on the landscape, but also maintain religious beliefs and practices as they relate to things like mobility and movement. You know, if in Pueblo history, there were plenty of times where people were not able to go to places of religious significance because, you know, Spanish colonialism, it prevented them from moving. You know, they had to reside in these missions and live amongst the the people that were in charge, which were the Spaniards. So, but when that changes, for instance, when they are no longer beholden to the wishes of the Spanish, they're able to kind of return to the center place. They're able to perhaps go to areas that were once important to them. And so that's another aspect of center, is kind of bringing things that were important in the past back to the present.
Yeah, and like the architecture that you showed, which like emphasizes the role of like the moon and the sun in their cultures, would you say like spiritually that might also be a center place because it's something that like grounds the life, or is that not really the idea of like what a center place is?
I think it is definitely part of making a place like Chaco Canyon a center place, as you say. I mean, like I mentioned, and I didn't put it in here because it's a little complicated to talk about sacred geography of the Pueblo people. It's very specific, but as I said, every Pueblo has 4 mountains that correspond to the cardinal directions, and that's their sacred mountain, and at the center is the village. So it's sort of this conception of the Pueblo as sort of the center of their world, and then everything radiates outward. There are sacred hills, sacred caves that are also aligned in these cardinal directions. And so at Chaco in the year 1000, aligning a center place architecturally, like say Pueblo Bonito, that big D-shaped Pueblo complex I showed you, to things like the sun and moon, you can see how that is in line with an idea of center place, because all these heavenly bodies and much greater things are in line with what you're doing as human beings.
Yeah, and like still with this idea of like movement, can you explain the cycles of like rest and renewal of the Tewa people?
Yeah, so if you are familiar with agriculture or doing agriculture on an annual scale, the fields, they lose their fertility basically, and you need to let those areas sort of rest, and then you need to plant crops in a new place. So rest and renewal is sort of this idea that places can lose their effectiveness, but only in a very impermanent way. So, for instance, among Indigenous archaeologists and Indigenous people, particularly that are Pueblo, they do not really view archaeological sites the way a Western scholar or archaeologist would, a non-Indigenous person. When we go to see an archaeological site, we see it as abandoned. We see it as a ruin. There's all this language that talks about sites that divorce the idea of people being there from. So it just becomes an object, basically, an object of study. Right? But rest and renewal as an Indigenous kind of dyad, if you will, logic of practice, it's sort of this idea that you're able to return to places after there has been a period of rest. And that is something that we see happens among the Pueblos. So for instance, a community in the Rio Grande called Pueblo is perhaps one of the most famous ones for this kind of rest and renewal logic. The Pueblo was pretty much without any Indigenous people for a good period of time up until the 1930s, and Indigenous people basically repopulated Puaki and built it back up. And now Puaki is one of the most powerful pueblos in that area. So that kind of idea that nothing is ever abandoned. It's just that it's sort of in rest. It's waiting to kind of receive people again. And we actually see this in archaeological history too. There's plenty of, during that Pueblo Revolt period that I was talking about, there were sites on the Paredo Plateau that were reoccupied in the 1680s that were built in the 1300s and 1400s. And so there was a period of, say, rest for those places, but after the Spanish were driven out, there was more of a reason to return to these places that were imbued with meaning of a time before the Spanish came and changed their lives. So I think that sort of captures what that is.
Yeah, and like the whole idea of like Spanish intrusion, what is the social memory of like Spanish colonization that the Tewa did face, and how is that like a continual process so people understand that, like you said, it's not monolithic, but something that like is a continued struggle, but also one like filled with vitality?
Yeah, well, obviously the memory of the Pueblo Revolt among the Pueblo people is a point of great pride, right? Because they were able to drive the Spanish out for 12 years and enjoy a period of independence after a very well orchestrated revolt. But after that period, Don Diego de Vargas, who was a Spanish conqueror, returned to the Rio Grande and reconquered the Pueblo people is the kind of the phrase that's used, the reconquest period. And so while there was this successful period of independence, it wasn't the end of the story, sadly. So there's sort of this struggle, I think, with having this reverence for a period of great resilience and resistance and overcoming a colonial power, but also ultimately, eventually sort of succumbing to that power. But importantly, persisting even on through that. So, we know that the Spanish didn't destroy the Pueblos and their identities and their practices because they still exist today, and it's still very, very much coherent with the way things were done during Spanish colonialism and before it. There are plenty of Hispanic communities that are intermarried with Pueblo people or Pueblo people that have Hispanic family members. And so there's also this kind of dual identity, right? That you identify as being Hispanic, but also being Pueblo and what that sort of means. But I would say generally, I think that the social memory is that the Spanish did a lot of damage. There was a great deal of cruelty during Spanish colonialism and after, and I think that is there's a firm rejection of that period, and with the recent toppling of monuments, to Confederate generals and soldiers and things, there was also the toppling of monuments to conquistadors in Albuquerque and Santa Fe and things like that. So a very active kind of resistance to memorializing these figures that were deeply cruel to Pueblo people. There's also, I'm trying to remember blanking on the name, but there's a festival that happens in Santa Fe every year that is sort of, it's a reverence for the Spanish history of New Mexico and Santa Fe, and people walk the streets dressed like Spanish conquistadors and things like that. And plenty of people protest this today. So you can see that there's this kind of tension between honoring some of the better qualities of Spanish heritage that the Pueblo people actually kept, like food and various ways of sort of perfecting and improving their lives. Also, that there's plenty of Catholic belief among Pueblo people because the Franciscan friars still have relationships with the Pueblos. They still attend feast days and sit at the tables of many Pueblo people. So they're very much present and in the lives of the Pueblos today. It's just a matter of, again, striking that balance between some of the better things that can come about from these kind of cultural encounters and some of the more traumatic histories that persist.
Mhm. And maybe to end it off, I guess, what do you hope the impact of your research to be? Maybe something like more short term, like pre-COVID perhaps, and then like long term, like where do you think this field is going?
Yeah, so if we're talking about, just my collaborative archaeology project, I think that what could come of it is I could, provide this Pueblo with more information about their archaeological history to inform what they already know. And I like to phrase it that way, that what they already know because of their recorded oral histories that were recorded over 100 years ago of how they moved from one place to the next. My project doesn't aim to clarify or confirm or contest any of the oral histories. It's just that the archaeology can be an added layer to that story. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will try like append any of those claims. But I would like to see it, kind of support the oral history so they can use it to fortify land claims in the future, and also perhaps incorporate some of this project in the short term into a museum that they're actually building in the Pueblo. So they'll have, I don't know if you're familiar with the Pueblo, but one of the most famous Indigenous potters in the world is from San Ildefonso. Her name was Maria Martinez, and she made these beautiful black pottery vessels and bowls, and just really famous for her craft and style. And those will undoubtedly be featured in the museum, but it would be great to feature some of the archaeological history that's lesser known.
Yeah, well, for that, I would like to say, like, I hope your research goes in like great directions and definitely gets integrated. And I'd also like to thank you for like coming and taking your time to share all this research to all the students.